Hey, it's Anthony, and I'm back at the post office for another day of reselling some of my old photography equipment, including this camera in this box, which is the Sony A100. So if you know anything about digital cameras, you know that Sony is one of the leading brands along with Canon and Nikon, and you could throw Olympus and Pentax, who have some good models in there as well. But Sony entered the market as a company that was pretty much known for headphones and, Walkmans and the like. So it was pretty laughable when they introduced their first camera, which was what's in this box here, the Sony A100. The Sony A100 inherited the Minolta technology. So Minolta had been a Japanese camera company and is still around in copiers and imaging and things like that. But Sony acquired the photography part of Minolta and basically built on that heritage. And one thing that Sony had going for it, in addition to all this wonderful Minolta glass, all the lens lineup that Minolta had in the past, was that they had the ability to put into the camera in-body stabilization. So what that means is that if you shake the camera this way, inside the camera will adjust for that and hold your picture steady. Of course, that's been a feature in camcorders for some time. I don't know exactly when it hit the digital camera, the DSLR market, but up to that point, image stabilization had been done only inside the lens itself, and the lenses were designed also to have that shift in the opposite direction of the way that you move to keep the image stable. What Sony did is they put that in the camera body so that every lens that you put on the camera was automatically stabilized, because the whole system is stabilized. With Canon, you have to pay extra money to get a good lens that has that type of technology, and same with Nikon, at least at the time. So that was innovative of Sony to do, and that's the reason why I got the A100 camera, was because of the innovation that Sony was showing in photography. And it's somewhat of a gamble, because that was their very first camera that they had ever put out in terms of a DSLR, a digital single lens reflex camera. And boy, I had that camera, I slept with that camera. I mean, I had that camera with me everywhere for a good couple of years. And cameras, they're generally, an entry-level camera, they say that you'll probably get 100,000 pictures out of it. That's how many shutter actuations the camera's designed for. But I probably put 500,000 photos on this camera here. I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, I was starting from scratch. I would put a long lens, which is a horrible telephoto lens, the 75-300 that Sony produced, and that combined with the A100 could barely even track a squirrel in a park to get the dumb thing in focus. And if you were going to get a child in focus who's swinging on a swing set, nearly impossible, given the low ability of that camera to track objects in motion. But I would put that long lens, and I would look at a weed out in a cornfield. During the winter time, cornfield is plowed under, but there's a weed growing with ice on top of it, and I'm trying to get the weed in focus, and the whole weed is not in focus, and I couldn't figure out what the issue was with that, because I didn't know about depth of field. I didn't know how much of the image is actually going to be in focus, and how that depends on the length of your lens, the size of your sensor, the size of your aperture, things like that. So I learned everything in photography from the ground up using this Sony A100, which is now broken. The shutter's broken. But there is a market for people who have purchased old models, and some of these people are handy people and know how to repair things, so they might be able to swap that shutter out. Not really sure what else you would do with this camera, because it was good at ISO 100 for taking pictures on a sunny day of whatever is outside. If you get it into a dark environment, it's going to struggle. The images are going to have a lot of noise. The camera with just graininess in the picture, and the camera won't be able to focus that well. In fact, I shot my first weddings with this camera, and it didn't want to focus in the dark in this reception area that I was at. So I had a 50mm lens, and I would literally look down at the 50mm lens, and I would turn it to 10 feet away from me, or I would turn it manually focusing to 20 feet away from me, and I would make sure that I was roughly 10 or 20 feet away. And it worked. The majority of those shots were on point when it came to focusing. So good experience with this first camera model. This other one that I've got is the Sony A55. It was a mirrorless camera, which means that it doesn't have a mirror mechanism that flips out of the way to allow light to come through the lens and then get to the shutter. It pretty much just constantly stays down, and the light passes through a semi-transparent lens. The cool thing about this model is that when you look through the optical viewfinder in the back of the camera, like you're taking a picture, what you look at is what you're going to get, because it's electronic. So if it's way too bright, your picture's going to be way too bright. And there's no way really to get a bad exposure on that camera, because you see exactly what it's going to look like before you press the shutter. This one, the A100, for example, you're kind of in the dark, especially if you're just starting on your path to photography. This one, the A55, I took with me. I can feel how much lighter it is than even the A100 here. I took this with me because of its lightness to India, and used that as a secondary camera. I held it down by my hip a lot of the time and just took street photography as I was walking through the crowded streets of Kathmandu and Nepal. And then when we went over to India and into Delhi and Dehradun and other places as well. Used it for video. Took a lot of video off the train lines there in India, risking life and limb to hang off the side of that thing to get the footage that I wanted. I was really looking for elephants and tigers and things of that nature. Didn't see any of those, but had fun nonetheless. So two more significant pieces of photography history. The one I delivered yesterday was the Sony A700. So this clears out my line of 3 Sony cameras, each of them very different in terms of their capabilities. The A700 and the A100 are much more similar than the A55, which has got that translucent mirror technology. So I ended up switching over to Canon because it took so long for Sony to reveal where they were headed after they produced the A700, which is a really nice camera. I thoroughly enjoyed shooting with the A700. It was a significant upgrade over the A100. But there really wasn't any sense that Sony was going to put out the next version of whatever the camera model was going to be. And part of the reason for that was they were working behind the scenes and coming up with a whole new technology, really playing on mirrorless cameras. And so they've got a whole different mount. These are alpha mount. It uses the old Minolta legacy mount. And what they're doing now is they're producing, I think it's the E mount. So it's a completely different way for the lens to connect to the camera. And the smaller camera bodies, the lenses also tend to be smaller, but the technology that they're putting into those cameras are just astounding. I wanted to leave you with those of you who might be aspiring photographers who want to learn photography. I would encourage you to get not the most basic camera, but maybe one just above that to help you in your learning. And maybe that's not as relevant now as it was in 2006 when I first purchased the A100 here. That's when so much of the autofocus technology, for example, was still fairly primitive. My cell phone now, and your cell phone, probably does a whole lot better tracking moving objects than this does. I mean, there's just no question, it completely does. But there were many hours of frustration where I felt that I was not a very good photographer. And it wasn't necessarily because I was lacking in skills. I just didn't have a camera that could track that squirrel in the park, or that could track that child in the swing set swing. So it's one of those things that you upgrade your equipment and you instantly become a better photographer, and there is some truth in that. That being said, I used to teach photography at the university level. I've had students come into my classes with pro cameras that wouldn't know what end of the camera to look through, and were just horrible photographers at the beginning of the course, and probably thanks to my teaching, they were horrible photographers at the end of the course as well. I've had people show up with the little Nikon Coolpix cameras, almost disposable little pocket cameras, and shot amazing stuff. And I've always felt that anybody with just a decent cell phone can be a marvelous photographer if they just have the eye and learn about lighting and composition, things like that. Anyway, I'm gonna take these into the post office and get rid of the Sony line of cameras. I think it'll be just a gap, because eventually I would love to invest in the new Sony technology, the new A7 line or A9 line, which are just fabulous cameras, ridiculous in their ability to track objects that are in motion. So the upcoming Olympics that were supposed to be the summer in 2020, Canon had some wonderful cameras and great lenses that could take, in a span, 20 in-focus images compared to Canon's best at, let's say, 10 images during that section. It's the same segment time. And that's partly because Sony could see through the lens and never lose focus. I mean, it could see through the lens and see through the mirror and never lose focus of the object that's moving. So pretty cool technology that has just come so far in the last several years. All right, that's my little camera commentary here on April 10th, 2020.